I know it makes a Cambridge-educated Englishman cringe when I use Dr. Seuss grammar in the title, but why and who sent Meng Wanzhou to Canada is the question today, David. And it's interesting because, in this image that I've created, one of our viewers wrote to me and told me that BBC stands for Busy Buggering Children. Is that correct? As I hadn't heard that before.
There's a variety of interpretations, but if you look at that statue, that's Eric Gill, 1934, right, outside the main door into BBC Broadcasting House, where you and I were, amazingly enough, in January of last year, right?
And thank you for reminding me, David. We've just reposted that trip to Cambridge for viewers, sponsors, unfortunately only on Subscribestar right now. So people who are on subscribestar.com/reverse-CSI or subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth can see our trip to Cambridge. I have some excellent news, David, this morning. Patreon has opened a support ticket into the specific problem that I identified with their chief technology officer. And so we are very close to offering the Crowdsource the Truth video server to all of our sponsors. And I want to thank everybody who sponsors the show.
Yeah, and I can't thank you enough.
But please carry on about Eric Gill and his insane sculptures.
It's not insane, and I challenge all of our listeners, and this should be going around the world, to interpret this statue outside Broadcasting House, British BBC Broadcasting House. And the BBC was founded, remember, on the 18th of October, 1922, which is almost exactly 100 years to the release of a digital virus at Hotel Pierce in New York by effectively Bill Gates and Johns Hopkins University, and the release of a real virus at the Wuhan military games. But I digress. So going back to that statue by Gill, for me, I interpret that as a bearded man, an adult, offering the likes of Bill Gates and Bill Clinton that if they partake of the sexual exploitation of children, such that the people taking the pictures can then control the abuser, they can access great power and great riches and ultimately control the world. So if you look at that that's my interpretation. Everyone else is free, but don't you find that that's an obscene statue? Over to you.
Absolutely, David. That's why I made that joke about busy buggering children, because it's not just the statue. It's the employment of Jimmy Savile for so many years, where people must have known what was going on. The cover-up, once his crimes became known, and the fact that they would be associated with a guy like that, the crimes would become known, and this statue would remain there. I mean, it's brazen, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. And this is hubris on a grand scale, because they think we're all stupid, right?
Right.
And I think many of us spend a great deal of our time being stupid, right? But not all of our time. No, but I mean, it's the nature of things. I wonder, in certain areas, I'm totally useless and I'm not very practical. And I should have blown myself up many times in the oil industry, but thankfully I survived. But when you go into the main door of the BBC, and that, I don't know when the building was commissioned, but the carving was commissioned in 1934, you enter the haven for, I would allege, a new world order, which is controlled through pedophile entrapment and blackmail, right? And provided you go through that door and you submit, listen and obey, then you have the opportunity of being very rich and very powerful, right? But digress and divert, and you're dead, right?
Yeah.
Like Jill Dando.
Exactly.
That I think blew the whistle, or tried to blow the whistle, on Jimmy Savile, who operated, I think, for 50 years within the BBC, running, I believe, a pedophile entrapment ring. So on the left of your collage, and I take my hat off it, I mean, it's just so brilliant. We've got this Meng Wanzhou, right, with an ankle bracelet. And the story is she's being sheltered, I would argue, by the Trudeau administration in Vancouver, when she should be facing, with her crony colleagues in Huawei, a RICO charge in Brooklyn. What is it? The Eastern District Court of New York?
Yes.
Right? And what Trudeau is desperately anxious to do, I believe, is trade her, at least make a symbolic trade of this woman for a couple of, and I don't mean to demean those two characters, but there's a couple of Canadians being held by the Chinese Communist Party in China. And what the elite would like to do is swap them and come out of it covered with glory. And I think we have an obligation to make sure that doesn't happen. And today's news that I got through a couple of sources, I think is pretty staggering for all those people who up to now have chosen to dismiss us as conspiracy theorists or whatever, where the news of 215 children found buried at a former BC residential school. And I think that's today's, I can't see the date on that, but I think
it was from today or yesterday, the 27th.
Okay, so now
wait a minute, it's in French, I think. Oh no, the name is.
Yeah. That's one of those unpronounceable First Nations
Ground penetrating radar was used, David, to locate the remains. They said that the remains were confirmed last weekend.
Now, this is a staggering concept for us to go on. Now, I think perhaps you might just touch on this concept of anchoring bias. I think anchoring bias can work multiple ways. It's not that we found this story, but we've basically been exposed to this story, which connects to the narrative, linking back to the residential schools through the development of, for example, Starnet Communications at 425 Carroll Street, which was engaged from 1996 to the time of the raid of the 20th of August 1999 in generating hardcore adult and child pornography online in 60 countries, together with online gaming. And the raid removed all the evidence. Is there not, sort of rhetorical question, a theme here that you can have a residential school that was actually taken over by the Trudeau administration in 1969 from the Catholic Church and then run, I think, to 1979? So why wouldn't it be a legitimate question to ask, well, what will the autopsies, and there has to be autopsies on every one of those bodies, what will the autopsies of those children show? And I suggest they were probably murdered through what's now described as a RICO offense, the sexual exploitation of children. And that is to say,
we don't have evidence of that yet, but it is certainly odd that children would be buried, and so many, not in a cemetery, but outside a school. I mean, that is very suggestive of something, foul play.
Well, I don't know that it's even outside the school. It's probably the grounds of the school, right? So there's a little backyard where these children, perhaps, were tortured to death in the school by visitors. That is to say, the school was pimping their children.
Now, David, didn't you tell us, we did a whole episode about these residential schools maybe 2 years ago, where this was a whole scandal already. This is a new chapter in the scandal.
Well, yeah, I mean, the number of graves found, or at least announced, and I suppose they've been, now what's happened to those bodies, skeletons? This should be a crime scene. Where is the yellow tape? Right? I mean, until they find out how those children died, the presumption perfectly legitimately would be that they were murdered. There was a child there as 3 years old. Now, some might die of disease, but even so, that doesn't explain how they weren't returned, the bodies weren't returned to the families to be buried in the traditional or ritual style of the First Nations. So this is a cover-up, right? And the theme of this First Nations sexual abuse of children, it runs right through the present, through the downtown east side, right through to the raid on Starnet, where I believe 150 law enforcement officers raided Starnet on the 20th of August 1999 from the IRS, US Customs, right, CIA, the FBI, Vancouver Police, Port Coquitlam Police, Delta Police, and the high-tech squad from Ottawa. and they took all of the evidence away of hardcore adult and child pornography and online gaming in 60 countries, and they took it somewhere. And my current theory is they merged it with the BBC Studios online network built by Huawei.
Now, let me pause you for a second, David, because this is another one of these. I had a bit of a revelation last night in our conversation preparing the graphic and everything, because there have been a few occasions during the course of our collaboration where, and I've told you this before, when we first met and started doing shows, it was interesting. It was a bit like, how do I explain this? I've worked on films. I'm thinking particularly of a horror film that I worked on, where the story kind of doesn't make sense, but you're so riveted by what's going on minute to minute that you get to the end of it and you're like, well, all right, I understood that on a certain level. And I'm not saying that what you say doesn't make sense, but it's frequently presented in a way that overwhelms the mind, that there's so much behind it that the casual observer might not be able to make sense of it for themselves, so they presume it doesn't make sense. But I've had several occasions where there's been a light bulb moment where suddenly I say, holy cow, how could David be wrong? And I want to talk for a minute about this Newsweek article that we've shown many, many times, Sex, Bets, and Bikers. It really is one of the definitive elements of reporting on this StarNet communications raid. And I wanted to juxtapose it for you and the audience with this much more recent Newsweek article from a little over a week ago about this inside the military's secret undercover army. This is telling us all about signature reduction. And I wonder, David, is it possible that Newsweek itself is playing the BBC role right here and doing some signature reduction of the crimes at StarNet Communications, signature reduction of this signature reduction force?
Well, totally. And there are a number of phrases that gradually, as I get my head around, I realize the significance. I don't think I'd heard the word signature reduction before about 7 days ago, right? And then this other term cropped up of anchoring bias.
Right.
And some, obviously, months ago, we've talked about the parallel narratives generated by the BBC, which they will be using in this year's documentary, 911, the 20th anniversary. Mm-hmm. And you put all those three together, signature reduction, parallel narrative, and anchoring bias, and provided you have three networks in place, you can attempt the overthrow of, for example, the United States government, as was attempted, I believe, on 911. And the three networks that I think are absolutely critical here are, perhaps the most important one is the human intelligence. Secondly, well, the second and third is not necessarily in order of importance. It depends on the timing. But the second is signals intelligence. And the third is financial intelligence. Unless you have those three networks in place such that you can coordinate and synchronize an attack, and particularly, perhaps the most important is this recent term that I've learned of anchoring bias. If you can inject your news, right, into the public collective mind, and let's take the death of George Floyd, where the BBC put out the story of his death 1 day or 2 days afterwards, which juxtaposed the term Black Lives Matter, and the text of that press release or BBC News was in 50 languages, including Pidgin, right, which is spoken by about 70 million people in Nigeria, where I lived for 3 years, right?
Is that the clicking
that means to say,
language?
No, that's, well, I can't even pronounce it, but Tkokta, South Africa, I think. I can't do the clicking. I don't have the labial, is that the right word? Geometry, right?
I don't know.
Perish the thought. Let's digress.
Yeah.
Let's divert.
Yeah.
Labial is tongue, right?
Let's move on from that, David.
Okay.
Lingual, I think, would do with the tongue.
Oh dear, really, I've made a terrible mistake. I apologize to
That's okay.
anyone in the audience who's shocked. But moving on. So Black Lives Matter, 50 languages, audience of 500 million people. The BBC controls and commands, I believe, globally, anchoring bias. And if you look at all of these mass casualty events or high profile, take, for example, the shoot up of Charlie Hebdo in Paris, right? Or the Bataclan Theatre. It's always the BBC is on scene, either directly or through proxies, to pick up the early footage that it puts out on this amazing network that has been put in place. And the 100th anniversary will be on the 18th of October next year.
Oh, wow.
And these people like anniversaries. And remember the Rhodes Scholarship Scheme, the will was a 200-year program, right, to take over the world on behalf of the English or the Anglo-Saxon race. And that was put in place.
What about Mao's 100-year program? It's faster.
Well, exactly. Except that Mao learned everything at the hands of the BBC, in my opinion, because the BBC is generating this Fabian dream of Pierre Trudeau, right? The modern Fabian is basically heavily involved in population and eugenic control, centralized credit, and government by elite bureaucrats. Now, that's what we got today, right?
Yeah.
The government in New York has collapsed, hasn't it? I mean, they're just a joke.
Well, yes.
It's a trifecta, right? Where the different orders of government is focused almost entirely on the trivial. It's been extorted into focusing on that. What's that? Myopic concentration on the distance between the people, whether or not they're wearing masks and whether or not they're being vaccinated. So
well,
now
there's a
with
lot
this
of talk about the
handshake,
vaccine passport.
right, exactly. So here you have Pierre Trudeau shaking the hands of Mao Zedong in 1973. Now, just to remind people, the National Socialists probably killed 20 million people, right? Stalin's collectivization and so on killed 50 million, and Mao Zedong killed 80 million, or is responsible for the murder or deaths of 80 million. Why are we celebrating these people, right? Their graves should be dug up and their ashes scattered to the winds. But you see, Pierre Trudeau was a great fan of tyrants because he loved the idea of controlling population and ultimately reducing the population along that Malthusian line that the population was growing at a fast rate than the food required to keep them alive. So in struts Meng Wanzhou. She comes to Vancouver in 2001 when it would appear Justin Trudeau and his roommate, Christopher Charles Ingvelson, had or were developing an international pedophile ring.
Didn't you also tell me that somebody having something to do with the BBC developed the ankle bracelet?
Well, that's a Serco development. And this was pioneered by a guy called Tom Stacey, who's a well-known member of White's Club. And
Right,
he
that's
made
what I
a
was
presentation about tagging prisoners so they would spend less time in jail. And the proposal was, I think, at St. Erin's Hotel in London in 1983. And ultimately, that was picked up because a major part, perhaps the most crucial part of population control, is tracking the people you want to control. And there's a couple of technologies that are very relevant, particularly in Vancouver, in the context of Vancouver. Obviously, the ankle bracelet is one. I mean, I think in fiction they talk about a chip inside your body so that you wander around and
I don't know about fiction. That's coming soon to a body near you.
Absolutely. Via Spectre, you know, the James Bond film, right? But perhaps the most current, significant, and dangerous is artificial intelligence for face recognition. So you can use closed circuit television, and basically they've developed a technique where they can see through or interpret a face even when it's wearing a mask. Right?
But David, before we move off the Fabians, I think it's important that we remind everybody, because I just found out about this, I think last week, maybe people don't know, but the crest or the the coat of arms or whatever this thing is from the Fabian Society is literally a wolf in sheep's clothing. That's quite odd. And I was just kind of wondering last night, with all of this centralized control and everything, what did the Fabians, if anything, have to do with Nazis? And just Googling Fabian Society Nazis, it seems like they're pretty close.
Well, totally. It's one needs to start. I think it would be wonderful to educate our young people at universities on the DNA of totalitarianism, right? Because there's been many governments, imperial governments, that have exerted total control over the subject. But the more successful, I would say there's only two really successful imperial governments in history. One is the Roman and the other is the British. Because now with the British, it's so successful, a lot of people think the British Empire is over. And I think if what you and I have done maybe has said, well, no, it's never been more powerful because it's better hidden. It's operating behind the scenes by tracking people, entrapping them, and then blackmailing them. So they play the dance, the marionettes, but the puppeteer is almost invisible. And the puppeteer now, I believe, controls those three networks: the human intelligence network, the financial intelligence network, right, and the signals intelligence network. And if we can just flip very quickly to the patent for the BBC of 1998, which has the title Spoken Text Display Apparatus for the Generation of Television Signals. I kept puzzling around in my head, was the BBC in charge of signals intelligence or human intelligence? I think that it will be an interesting debate. But at the end of the day, I've come up with, I think, the outfits that controls these three networks is BBC controls a global human intelligence network with the capacity for injecting anchoring bias into a story such that you can't get that out of people's skulls. So when Jane Stanley in New York, for example, 15 minutes before building number 7 collapsed, she announces building number 7 has collapsed, right? That's a very important on BBC television, because people will now come to think that anyone who comes along with the theory that BBC building number 7 was blown up is a conspiracy theorist. But of course it was blown up. I'm an expert in explosives, not in blowing up buildings. But you can see the spine of the building was actually broken. The penthouse on the roof drops into the abyss within the building, and then it drops in its own footprint. Yeah. There's obviously no internal resistance, meaning the iron girders and so on, the steel trusses and so on, are actually being melted. That's the only explanation. But here's what's very interesting. It's probable that the command center for the attack in Manhattan was on the 21st floor or somewhere around there, where there was a joint office, I think, of CIA, Department of Defense, and IRS, very close to another office, which was the office of the Small Business Administration in a joint venture with the Equal Employment EEOC, the Equal Employment
Opportunity.
Opportunity.
Yeah.
Right.
But wait a minute, David, you just hit on something. This
Right.
damn clicking, I've been chasing this for a week, but we'll leave it for now. The Newsweek article, David, those offices in Building 7 that you've just mentioned, the Department of Defense, the CIA, I mean, this is all the same people who were involved with this signature reduction.
Yeah, totally. So the evidence of the three networks that had to be synchronized to pull off the 9/11 attack and inject the theory, probably 2 minutes before the second plane hit the south face of the South Tower, General Alexander Haig, he was the guy who celebrated the Tiananmen Square massacre by appearing on the podium in 1989, 4 months after Tiananmen Square massacre. So he was the former supreme Allied commander of Europe. Incidentally, just I'm not being a diversionary here, but I think he was a director of MGM. Didn't you tell me that MGM has just been bought by someone?
Amazon.
Well, and you look at the Amazon shareholders, and we're back to this routine of the ETFs. But what I'm saying is that there was obviously a very important need to reduce the signature of BBC Studios in 911 and point towards this guy in a cave in Afghanistan, who probably was on a dialysis machine in a hospital in Dubai. So you can only pull this kind of thing off if you have those three networks, if they're synchronized, right? And you can inject an anchoring bias into the narrative such that 20 years later, and this is the 20th anniversary to be celebrated, I use the word celebrated by the BBC in a documentary this year, right? 20 years later, we still have that anchoring bias stuck in the collective minds of the public, we the sheeple, right? But it was wrong and it is wrong, and we'll find out eventually. And I think we'll find it out through your show, Jason.
I hope that's true, David. And if we do, it's going to be in large part thanks to the sponsors on subscribestar.com/reversecsi, patreon.com/reversecsi, and Subscribestar and Patreon/crowdsourcethetruth. In less than half an hour, David, you and I are going to be doing our sponsor exclusive segment. And I think it's going to blow people's minds because we've been kind of dancing around the subject a little bit, but in today's sponsor-exclusive episode, David, I'm pretty confident that you're going to bring together with great specificity the link between all of these events and all of these individuals who are pictured in today's collage.
Well, yes, I hope so, and I believe what will be very interesting, I can pick almost arbitrarily, but I'll focus initially on a couple, and then perhaps we can take input from our listeners about what they would like to look at. But there are a couple of very high-profile events that took place in 2015, which was the year the Chinese Communist Party stopped, or allegedly stopped, the one-child policy, right? But because communists and socialists are what they are, they would never have dropped this dream of population control. So they had to replace, in 2015, the one-child policy.
David, I'm sorry. Stand by just one second. This clicking makes me nuts. I have to take apart the whole studio tonight. Just fix it real quick. This lengths to try to address this, and it's a stubborn problem. But you know, there's this, I don't know if we've seen this before. This is the CBC Digital Archives. It looks like a video of that very meeting.
Oh, yeah, that's probably, looks like the costumes and clothes are dated correctly. But so Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, they died in 76. But 4 years later, the Chinese Communist Party initiated the one-child policy and spread surveillance and tracking agents around the country so they could monitor if a woman had a second child and maybe park the second child with a grandparent. And these scumbags would then go in, and in some cases, they'd kill the child. And they got brownie points for maintaining or controlling the population. So already there's a brutal regime hungry for blood in China. And that progresses through to 2015, when the one-child policy was dropped, presumably because the Chinese realized there was such a dysfunctional society being brewed because they had an excess of men, because the preference was for the first child to be boys, right? And now I think the Chinese Communist Party is basically committed to World War III with all of its excess males who can't find wives and family, right, to keep the testosterone down. I'm being kind of frivolous there. The point is, in 2015, they needed a diversion from, I believe now, what is in place called the 610 Office Administration.
Right.
Now, the 610 Office concept was introduced in 1999 which was the year when Jill Dando was murdered. And I think that's critical, right?
Well, it's also the year of the StarNet raid.
Right. And the level 4 lab in Winnipeg had come on stream so they could start producing variants or engage in gain of function research and start replacing the old viruses that came out of the trade developed by Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton and Pierre Trudeau through the Connaught laboratories at the University of Toronto, which came up, I believe, with fractionated blood plasma enriched with HIV and Hep C.
Now, David, this 610 office diagram, it's very confusing. How did this wind up?
I don't think it's confusing if you think of the thing that really disturbs socialists and communists and global control is if a group of people from within family units start questioning the validity of the Communist Party's mantra, or maybe we can call it the BBC's mantra, because that mantra is outside the carving that we don't see on your collage, just around the corner, which is the carving of a sexualized boy Christ up on the cross, serenaded by a couple of winged figures, where there's a book held to his private parts, and the word is the first word of the Benedictine Creed, listen and obey. But isn't that the essence of communism? They've got nothing to offer other than fear and enormous power for the devotees or the disciples. I mean, that's another disgusting carving that should be ripped down. But basically, I'm saying that the BBC is a corrupt organization, and I actually have trouble accepting that because so many of their shows are beyond brilliant, their comedies and the quality of their news and so on. But the inner core, the DNA of the BBC is corrupt.
But David, isn't that the essence of a parallel narrative, of a limited hangout, to cause you to have so much trust in one aspect that you inherently trust another? There's something else, David. There's value to reviewing these things extensively and going over them again and again. This is called Ariel between something in gaiety, prosperity and gaiety, something like this. And the previous thing is Ariel and Prospero. But this looks like an older individual than the child depicted in the first thing. So perhaps it's illustrating the progression of that child through something or other?
Yeah, absolutely. A child is obviously incredibly vulnerable from the time of birth onwards. And people of bad, malicious thinking, etc., can groom that child and basically turn it into a weapon. And this outfit, Maximus, that I talk about, that I believe is the center of the financial intelligence network, is very good at targeting a family and breaking it up. You know, it picked up the contract for Family Maintenance Enforcement Program in BC in 2001, the year Meng Wanzhou arrived. But prior to that, Maximus had got the contract to administer the Deadbeat Parents Punishment Act, introduced by the Clinton administration in 1998. And what I'm saying is, what they've done, these people, is allow Maximus to get into the financial intelligence networks of the family itself, where basically they can extort money from one side of the family, withhold payments to the other, and get the family broken up. The children are alienated from the parents, but they now become very useful tools for the New World Order, right? And this woman, Meng Wanzhou, she arrives, as I say, in Vancouver in 2001. And what's very important for Canadians to know, now, am I disgusted by the fact that Canadians choose not to know? I'm certainly embarrassed and ashamed, but that's perhaps the best explanation I can come up with at the moment, because at that time, in 2001, the pig farm killings were still going strong. There'd been no attempt to solve the murders, where the BBC talks about possibly 4,000 Aboriginal women going missing from 1980, probably murdered, right? And you've got this woman arriving, where she's obviously the daughter of the founder of Huawei. We know Huawei had backdoored Nortel and the Entrust public key infrastructure. So she arrives at a time when it would appear she had access to all of the, and let me repeat that, human intelligence, financial intelligence, and signals intelligence necessary to attempt the overthrow of the United States government on 9/11.
David, we've just received a comment here that perhaps might expand our understanding of this. Pontifex Maximus, are you familiar with that? The bridge builder?
I didn't know the term pontifex. Well, that's interesting. Where did you see the bridge builder?
Well, this came to us from Mr. Wordsworth, who's joining us on Twitch. And just says Maximus from Pontifex Maximus, the bridge builder. The Pontifex Maximus was the chief high priest of the College of Pontiffs in ancient Rome. This was the most important position in the ancient Roman religion, open only to participants. Patricians. What is that? I don't even know what that is. Patricians were originally a group of ruling.
They're the head cheeses.
That's a weird sculpture. There's so much weird stuff going on. But
yeah, if you forget your history, sorry.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, let me just pick up on that. So, wouldn't it be interesting? And this is discovery on the fly at its finest. But the mention of the word bridge. Well, what about the Federal Bridge Certificate Authority? Right. If you had access to the root key, which the Ministry of Defense had through the Combined Communications Electronics Board, you control the Federal Bridge. You control the four big defense contractors, Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and Northrop Grumman, all of which are controlled in turn by the exchange-traded funds that control Maximus. So when I talk about Maximus being in charge of the money, I believe through the exchange-traded funds that I think control 20% of Maximus, they basically, by 9/11, control the companies that should have stood up on 9/11, but were actually stood down through signals emanating from down at the bottom there, I suggest, the UK Ministry of Defense, Combined Communications Electronics Board. So Meng Wanzhou, the daughter of the Huawei founder, which had penetrated Nortel, right, which is facing a RICO charge in Brooklyn, I believe she's uniquely positioned to coordinate those three networks and attempt the overthrow of the Republic. Over to you.
And of course, you've told us about how Entrust was spun off from Nortel. There's certainly no doubt that Verizon Business, loads of these companies would be using Huawei technology, right?
Well, absolutely. So Huawei starts in life in 1988, importing Nortel switchboards, I believe, from Hong Kong, then reverse engineering them, adding some functionality, and basically driving Nortel into bankruptcy and stealing all of its intellectual property, right? So in the run-up to the 9/11 attack, there were Nortel fiber optic links being installed in World Trade Centers 1, 2, and 7. But unbeknown to the American government and George Bush, but certainly known to the people squatting in building number 7, I believe they knew that they could backdoor the response to the exercise of 9/11, which involved pulling the United States Air Force out of position into Alaska and Canada during exercises staged with the leftovers from the Trudeau government. So they basically left Washington and New York undefended, right? They stood down the United States Air Force and they flew these decoy and drone maneuvers through the technology developed by McDonnell Detweiler, right, using the uninterruptible autopilot.
David, look at this article here. This is from 2020, from global news. This is a major mainstream outlet in Canada, right? Inside the Chinese military attack on Nortel. How was this not a gigantic story?
Well, it would have been, except remember, we're coming back to signature reduction. At every
Yes.
opportunity, these clowns try and remove the signature of BBC Studios, which
Well,
is
or
the grand,
Huawei
well,
or whoever.
and Huawei and Maximus.
Right. And themselves. And Newsweek. They're all trying to
Yes,
reduce their signatures. You and I are out
correct.
here with a gigantic signature. We're like, hey, here we are. And they're
Right.
shooting at us and they're missing.
Exactly. And that's very flattering. You know you're over target when you're getting the flag. But see, this particular article today perhaps is a seminal, because I can say to lots of people who dismiss me as a conspiracy flake, well, take your head from where the sun doesn't shine and read this article, right, about 215 children found buried, and tell me I'm still a conspiracy theorist, right? There has to be a conspiracy to bury children on the grounds of the school and not send them, the bodies, home to their parents to be buried with proper respect.
But what
There is a
about, I mean,
conspiracy.
where are all these parents? I mean, whether or not the children were properly buried, certainly the parents would know that they're dead. Are they, what,
And that's where they're suffering. And that's where, because you and I, we know, we've walked around the downtown east side, you see institutional and community pain, right? Those people are traumatized. Remember the warning mural outside. Basically, that message with the mural is listen and obey. Do not tread, do not dig too deep, right? There was a process with a number of cooperators or collaborators, but remember the word cooperation as it comes to extortion, inside that community. Brothers selling sisters, aunts selling daughters, right? And so on. So the community has been compromised through a sequential process. It wasn't invented, but it was probably perfected by Pierre and Justin Trudeau.
Yeah. Well, they're Fabians, and people don't even know what that is. They had I think there was a singer in 1950 named Fabian. So Fabian Society,
Right.
I for a long time thought were fans of that guy until I met you.
Right. And then we run into Fabius Maximus. What was that,
Right.
200 BC? And he's the authority on the art of war for the Fabians. He's called the Delaire, or the warty one, because he had a wart on his nose. But basically, he decided he wasn't going to take on Hannibal and the elephants in the Alps. He would harass the supply chain, right, which is what they're doing today, the supply chain that would bring normally intelligent families together to discuss the scam, right? But more importantly, to go behind the front lines to the enemy's command center and take it out. So I would suggest in New York on 911, the command center was in building number 7, and all of the evidence would be in building number 7, right? And in the Washington, of course, the command center, the military command center, would be the Pentagon's US Navy command center, where we have people on the Pentagon lawn, and it's a classic example of anchoring bias. So the first thing we get on the Pentagon lawn is pictures of a hole in the wall and smoke and firefighters putting out or spraying foam on the grass. What we don't see, and what trickles in later, is that there's a group of people line abreast with brown paper bags wearing phony FBI t-shirts, picking up evidence and putting it in the brown paper bags and taking it away. Isn't that essentially the function of signature reduction? And then one of those pictures that looks like that, oh yes, if you zoom in, you can see AMEC about the
I
middle
think
of
this is not a high enough resolution version of this photograph, but it's right here.
Okay, AMEC had offices above Starnet Communications at 425 Carroll Street, right? So at the time of the raid, as far as I know, AMEC carried on, and AMEC in June of 2001 got a contract from Nortel, or what was left of it, because basically it's controlled by Huawei, to become an installer for Nortel equipment. together with Bovis, right? Bovis, I believe, built one of the Trump hotels in Chicago. It upgraded the Statue of Liberty, and it built those great holes in the ground, the 9/11 Memorial, right? And Bovis
And they got their
Amex,
construction sign there quickly. Like, why the hell did they need an Amex sign there when this is still kind of an emergency?
because they're sending a signal, we're in charge here,
Yeah.
right? Because what you've got there is evidence is being removed from the crime scene, just like the raid on the 20th of August of 1999. So as we approach the second part of the show, I think, and I'm ready to look at any major mass casualty event which has evidence of signature reduction, parallel narratives, and anchoring bias. But I'd like to look in particular at evidence that this was the case at the attack on Charlie Hebdo in Paris, right? And in the Bataclan Theatre, orchestrated, and this is my allegation, by BBC Studios out at Boulogne-Billancourt in a conspiracy with Huawei, which is in the same building, and next door to Russia Today, right? What I'm saying with that is you've essentially got the ingredients for a trifecta network, and I'm just extending the language, the vocabulary a little bit, where Meng Wanzhou, I allege, together with Justin Trudeau and his pedophile roommate, Christopher Charles Ingleson, would have been in a position to coordinate the signals intelligence, human intelligence, and financial intelligence necessary to attempt to overthrow the government of the United States. And had that fourth plane left on time, it would have taken out, in my allegation, the Capitol building. The Congress and senators, I believe the building had been mined with explosive. The Congress and senators would have been obliterated, right? But that plane was 41 minutes late. So they crashed it in a field outside Pennsylvania, right? And set up again, it's back to the anchoring bias.
David, excellent point coming here from Dave Cohen, who's in the comments on YouTube. He says that AMEC and Acme have the same letters, just rearranged, and that's the fictional company that creates everything that the coyote tries to use to kill the Roadrunner in children's cartoons. The other thing that occurs to me, David, we've looked at this photograph so many times. We've pointed out the anomalous nature of this, perfectly unburned, undirty piece of what appears to be an American Airlines plane. Also the fact that this woman is wearing clothing that just doesn't look like anything a person would buy for themselves, brand new, doesn't fit. Isn't this signature reduction, staging this nonsense on the lawn to remove the impression and solidify the anchoring bias that a plane hit this, such that there's virtually no limit to the number of times we can discuss or the amount of evidence we can present that shows that it can't be a plane, and so many people are still convinced that it was?
Yeah, totally. And there's always that great phrase, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? Absence of evidence can be a result of someone taking the evidence away. So you create a vacuum, the anchoring bias gets in first, right? And again, 2 minutes before impact on the south face of the South Tower, you have General Alexander Haig, former Supreme Allied Commander Europe, looking through the BBC's camera, or maybe it's Fox News, it's irrelevant.
Fox, yeah.
A picture of a nice gash on the north face of North Tower, notwithstanding there's 200,000 tons of structural steel in the building, which would bounce the plane off. But basically, you got the gash, and he's asked, so who do you think is behind it, right? And he says, well, I don't want to speculate. I don't have the information. You just know that he's about to speculate. And he says, we know it's either the Palestinians or Bin Laden group.
Yeah.
2 minutes later, there's the impact on the south face of the South Tower. And the Node brothers record that. They record both sides. One does one side, one does the other. And just to point out as a bit of a teaser, Nodes, Naudets, is an anagram of Duane Street, which is the ladder company that was deployed to that crime scene.
Wow, and then
And those
AMEC
guys
is an anagram of Acme. Listen, David, this clicking is making me nuts, so I want to just stop us here a little bit early so I can have some time to address my next idea at what might solve it. Before we leave, I want to remind everybody to visit your website, David, reversecciscripts.com. We've reestablished the YouTube playlist there so people can follow our YouTube videos. They can also sponsor you, David, by going to subscribestar.com/reversecsi or patreon.com/reversecsi. People can follow David on Twitter at CSI Hawkins. Follow his daily tweets and posts, and you can also sponsor Crowdsource the Truth by going to subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth or patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. We'll be back in less than 10 minutes, hopefully without this infernal clicking.